Let's start over with Asia and China, because there have been some developments just in the last 48, 72 hours, actually, with some Chinese military operations around Taiwan.
Yeah, look, I think we've been rightly focused on Ukraine over the past week, given President Zelensky's historic visit here to Washington and his speech before Congress. But a lot has been happening in Asia. We had, in the last few days, China flew 72 airplanes across the midline of the Taiwan Strait, threatening Taiwan once again. But you had other developments as well. Japan announced it would double its defense budget from 1% of GDP to 2% in the next 5 years. That's really big. And they also announced that they're going to acquire counter-strike capabilities. So think about hundreds of Tomahawk missiles. And this is a fundamental, again, change in how they understand and interpret their own constitution. So clearly they are gearing up for what's happening in Asia with the China threat. And at the same time here in the last 24, 36 hours, Taiwan announced that it would reverse its policy of a 4-month conscription for young Taiwanese men and increase it back to a year and increase its training. And of course, we had in the appropriations bill, the $1.8 trillion appropriations bill, billions of dollars for Taiwan arms. So a lot happening in that part of the world. You know, in my memoir that you mentioned, David, I described Northeast Asia as the geostrategic flashpoint of the 21st century. And you just see things moving around right now that give you a lot of concern. And we didn't even talk about North Korea and South Korea.
Well, and Mr. Secretary, I mean, you've actually done it. I've just read about it. My understanding is one of the best ways to avoid a war is to make sure you're prepared for it. And it really does raise the question, how prepared is Taiwan for increased pressure, at least, if not a war with China? Because certainly President Xi has not been very shy about saying he's willing to do that if necessary.
Well, they're not prepared enough. I was in Taiwan last year, just before Speaker Pelosi's visit, and I met with President Tsai and her cabinet, and I outlined a number of things that I thought they needed to do, which included increasing dramatically their defense budget, adopting an asymmetric warfare defensive approach, increasing conscription for at least up to a year, and then stockpiling food and weapons, improving the training of the reserves, a number of things. They seem to be on that path. That's a good thing. Washington is doing similar things with providing arms and additional training. And now I think we need to get more of our allies, more of our Western allies on board to support Ukraine because look, China threatens the entire geopolitical order in terms of what it wants to see, how it wants to overturn international rules of the road. So it's important that we all stand firm and present a solid defense against Chinese aggression.
Well, if you can, consistent with your other obligations, can you give us a peek into exactly how you plan, if you're Taiwan or the U.S. helping Taiwan, for a possible conflict with China? What kind of conflict are you preparing for? Is it an invasion? Is it basically an embargo where they've put a fleet around the island and cut it off? What do you prepare for?
Well, the worst case scenario is always a Chinese amphibious invasion of Taiwan, which is a very, very difficult operation. I don't believe the Chinese could really pull it off at this point in time. But the next thing, and in some ways more difficult, would be kind of what they did this past summer, where they had an air and missile embargo, if you will, or blockade of Taiwan, where they were shooting missiles into the waters or near the waters of Taiwan's major ports, and could pretty much shut down the country if they wanted to, which is why when I met with the Taiwanese last summer, we talked about the importance of stockpiling food and water and supplies and resources in case that happened. But look, again, I think it gets back to the Taiwanese people preparing their defenses. We all learned a lot from Ukraine's stalwart, courageous defense against Russia. And the lesson was a smaller country that's well-armed, that's willing to fight, and that can mobilize its people, can really beat back a tougher, bigger enemy. And that's exactly what Taiwan faces. And I think that's the lesson they learned. And I hope that's what Xi Jinping in Beijing has learned as well.
Mr. Secretary, put in perspective from a military point of view, the significance of some of the export controls now on semiconductors for China. We have a tendency at Bloomberg to regard it as a commercial issue, which it certainly is. But as I understand it, it's also very profoundly a military issue, given the way armaments are prepared now. Microchips are so incredibly important.
Oh, absolutely. Look, you look at our missiles, they will contain hundreds of semiconductors, hundreds of chips. And of course, many of them are the high-end chips that Taiwan, TSMC, and others produce. And so it's important that we have that supply intact, number one. And we learned that from COVID when I was at DOD in 2020 about the importance of intact, reliable supply chains. But also equally important, the flip side of the coin is making sure that China doesn't get access to those same type of high-end computer chips, semiconductors that will be instrumental in improving their military capabilities. Their ability to operate in space, underwater, in cyberspace, et cetera. It's the same things that we're denying the Russians right now. So, look, I think the CHIPS Act was very important. It was supported by the previous administration and this administration. I think there are other things that we need to do as well, such as rare earth materials, strategic resources such as those, to make sure that we have safe, reliable supply chains that we can count on when times get tough.
And finally, Mr. Secretary, let's turn to Ukraine, which we've talked about in the past. As you say, there was that dramatic speech from President Zelensky before the joint meeting of Congress. And I wonder what you took away from that and whether, in fact, the United States should be perhaps changing its attitude toward Ukraine, because certainly President Zelensky was not shy about saying he really appreciates what he's gotten, but he needs a lot more. Things like fixed-wing aircraft, things like longer-range missiles.
His visit was very important. His speech was very impressive. It sent a message to the Russians, of course, that the United States was standing behind them, particularly as we head into the winter months right now. And it was a chance for President Biden to message the American people and for us to message the allies. And look, I think we've done a good job, but we could be doing so much more. They do need fixed-wing aircraft. They do need tanks. They do need the means to conduct an offensive campaign, to do a counteroffensive. That's how you break a trench warfare type stalemate that we're kind of seeing now. That's at the operational level. At the strategic level, they need far more and greater air defenses. And look, the United States has done a lot, but we need our allies to do a whole lot more. Most of our allies have contributed less than $600 million or so in military aid. The United States, tens of billions of dollars. So if we can get more of our allies to do more of that, to provide those critical arms and pieces of equipment that I just mentioned, we could allow the Ukrainians to get on the offensive, to push the Russians out, and bring this war to a quicker conclusion than the path it looks to be on right now.
Well, that's just what I want to ask about, going on the offensive, as you just said, because I think in some quarters it might be thought, well, this is turning sort of into a stalemate, and this will go on for a long time and become chronic. It looks like perhaps that's what Vladimir Putin wants. If the Ukrainians are not winning this war, are they losing it ultimately?
No, not necessarily. But again, their country would remain occupied. And what we don't want is another frozen conflict like we have in Georgia or Moldova. So the Ukrainians have the momentum right now. We need to supply them. And you're right. Putin's strategy is to wait us out. I mean, that's why he is hammering Ukrainian cities, infrastructure, energy resources with ballistic missiles and drones. He wants to break the back, break the will of the Ukrainian people. We now see he's putting an embargo, if you will, on countries that put a price cap on oil. He wants to freeze them out, freeze us out a little bit also. He is playing for time, thinking that we will wobble, we will weaken. And look, there's some truth to that in the past. We've seen that. So it's important that we hold on, but at the same time, give Ukraine what they need to win. They have the will, they have the courage, they have the resolve. They've been showing a great deal of grit and success on the battlefield. We need to help enable that.
Talk to us about drones, if you would, Mr. Secretary, because certainly we've seen the use by Russia of drones, many of them, I think, supplied by Iran. We also are now picking up some reports of actually Ukraine using drones, although they haven't quite confirmed that, not for attack purposes. How important are drones in this battle on both sides?
Very important. It's a new element of warfare in the 21st century. You know, we've developed our share. I did as Secretary of the Army and Secretary of Defense. But drone technology and, of course, counter-drone technology as well, critically important. But you see the Ukrainians now using them to conduct long-range strikes, hundreds of miles into Russian territory to attack airfields from which Russians are launching bombers. So they're using it to great skill. And, of course, the Russians are using the Iranian drones to pummel Ukrainian infrastructure. So we need to give them the means to provide adequate air defenses against those, so that, again, we can protect civilians in Ukraine and civilian infrastructure.
Is that doable? Can you supply adequate defense against the drones?
You can, but it's not necessarily the high-end Patriot air defense systems. Those systems are great against ballistic missiles and fixed-wing aircraft, but you don't want to shoot a $3 million missile against a $200,000 drone. So I think I've argued that we need to give them more air defense guns. There are things called the ground-based phalanx air defense system that we use successfully in Iraq and Afghanistan. I think those are the things that the Ukrainians need as well to complement what would be a layered air defense system.